TUC Radio, San Francisco. Time of Useful Consciousness. Real History. The Myth of the Founding Fathers. This is part one of a four-part series on real history by the noted scholar and author Michael Parenti. Michael Parenti is among our leading progressive political analysts. He received his PhD in political science from Yale in 1962 and has taught at colleges in the US and abroad. The focus of his lectures is American democracy, US foreign policy, and the invented reality of the media. As the United States government claims to spread democracy around the world and is deeply involved in ghostwriting constitutions for other countries, the spotlight falls back on this country. Is the current U.S. system a democracy? Has it ever been one? In the Myth of the Founding Fathers, Michael Parenti takes us back to the early days of the Republic. Who were the Founding Fathers? What were their goals in writing the U.S. Constitution? Who did they exclude, and who did they favor? What was their attitude toward slavery? How many of them actually wanted to create a monarchy? And who, in the end, ratified the Constitution after it was written? Here is Michael Parenti with answers to these questions in part one of the lecture series on history, The Myth of the Founding Fathers.
This is Michael Parenti, and welcome to Real History, a series of talks by me on different subjects in history that are relevant for today's realities. Most people are never exposed to real history. In school, we usually don't even read history. We read history textbooks, mainstream ones that avoid the underlying realities and propagate all sorts of myths that serve the powers that be. Myths that are not very useful, in fact harmful to those of us who might want to believe in truth and in democracy. This particular segment of Real History is entitled The Myths of the Founding Fathers. As we were taught in school, a group of dedicated leaders of our young nation, called our Founding Fathers, met in Philadelphia in 1787 to build a nation and to write a constitution. The United States of that time has been described as an egalitarian society. It was supposedly free from the extremes of want and wealth that characterized the feudal old world. But in fact, there were landed estates and there were colonial mansions that were really quite impressive and demonstrated a most impressive accumulation of wealth. From the earliest English settlements, men of influence received vast land grants from the British Crown. By 1700, 3/4 of the acreage in New York State belonged to fewer than a dozen persons. By 1760, fewer than 500 men in 5 colonial cities controlled most of the commerce, the banking, the mining, the manufacturing, and most of the newspapers and journals on the eastern seaboard, and they owned most of the land. This was hardly your egalitarian middle-class society. As of 1787, property qualifications left perhaps more than a third of the white male population disfranchised. Property qualifications for holding office were so steep that most voters could not even qualify as candidates. Thus, a member of the New Jersey legislature had to be worth about £1,000, free of debt, even to run for office. There also were no secret ballots. The men who got together in Philadelphia to frame the Constitution were financially successful planters, slaveholders, merchants, creditors, bankers, and manufacturers. Who else can take 4.5 months off to go sit in Philadelphia and write a constitution? Many of them were linked to each other by kinship and marriage, and by years of service in Congress or the military or diplomatic service. And they had 3 things they wanted to do. They wanted to build a stronger central government to deal better with the conditions of trade and industry within the 13 states. They also wanted to build a stronger central government to deal better with other nations. But there was a third reason. It's the one that that the historians who don't want to bother with real history never talk about. The framers of the Constitution were very troubled with the increasingly insurgent spirit, rebellious spirit, among the common population. There were attempts to take over state governments, there was broad agitation, and the wealthy class looked to a national government as a means of protecting their interests, as a means of building a stronger mechanism of national control. Most historians say very little about the actual plight of the common people in that time. Most of the agrarian population, and about 85% of Americans in 1787 lived in the agrarian sector, most of them consisted of small farmers, tenants, or indentured servants. Indentured servants were white people who were in indenture, that is, they were in conditions of servitude. It wasn't quite slavery because it was for a fixed time and they could get out eventually. They could work their way out. These people were burdened by heavy rents, ruinous taxes, and low incomes. To survive, they frequently had to borrow money at very high interest rates. To pay their debts, they mortgaged their future crops. When you mortgage your future crop, you go still deeper into debt. So large numbers of them were caught in that cycle of rural indebtedness, which is today still the common fate of many agrarian peoples in many countries who were in the grip of the moneyed interests. Throughout this period, by the way, newspapers complained of, quote, increasing numbers of young beggars in the streets. Economic prisoners crowded the jails. Many were incarcerated for debts or non-payment of taxes. And among the American people there grew the feeling that the revolution against the English crown had been fought for no good reason. Disorders of a violent but organized kind occurred in a number of states. In the winter of 1787, the most dramatic disorder was when debtor farmers in western Massachusetts, led by Daniel Shays, took up arms. But their rebellion was crushed by the state militia after several skirmishes that left exactly 11 men dead and scores wounded. When the Founding Fathers, so-called Founding Fathers, met in Philadelphia, they were determined that persons of birth and fortune and affluence should control the affairs of the nation and check what they call the leveling impulses of the propertyless multitude that composed what Madison called the majority faction. James Madison, who played probably the most crucial role in the Constitution, putting the Constitution together, talked about how it was important in his famous Federalist Paper No. 10, how it was important to keep the spirit and form of popular government with only a minimum of the substance. How do you construct a government? This was the task, he said, that the framers were facing. How do you construct a government that would win some popular support but would not tamper with the existing class structure? A government strong enough to service the growing needs of an entrepreneurial class while withstanding the democratic egalitarian demands of the popular class. And the way you do it is by excluding the popular class from most of the crucial points of power. The framers all agreed with Madison when he wrote in his Federalist No. 10 that, quote, the most common and durable source of faction, and by faction he meant class whenever he used the word faction, the most common and durable source of faction has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Now, if you say that today, you're called a Marxist. Well, Madison was talking about reality, and we can't help it if certain forms of reality are Marxist. The first object of government, Madison went on, is the protection of different and unequal faculties for acquiring property. Elbridge Gerry, another one of the framers in Philadelphia, noted that democracy was the worst of all political evils. Both he and Madison warned of the danger of the leveling spirit. Roger Sherman of Connecticut, another delegate to Philadelphia, the people should have as little to do as may be about the government.